We're getting into the really serious topics.
hmm
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, we'll go ahead and kind of just introduce the topic and get this conversation started. I know that several people are going to be watching the recording. So if you're watching the recording right now, hi, thank you so much for catching this conversation. It's going to be a good one. So I'm Jason Wood. I am with Anid, and I've had the privilege of working alongside Mac for a while now in a volunteer capacity. And couple months ago, we were like, let's do an event around food insecurity and eating disorders. And now here we are in June, and we're making it happen. And we're making it happen in advance of the BIPOC Eating Disorders Conference, which is coming up in Houston. Yes, it's going to be live in person in Houston in July. And if you're not familiar with the conference, I think the phrase on the website says it all. And this is what it says on the BIPOC Eating Disorder website. But Black, brown, and indigenous people of color have often been excluded from eating disorder treatment, employment, advocacy, and research. That's why the BIPOC Eating Disorders Conference was created. And I applaud everybody who's been working behind the scenes to organize it, everybody who's supporting the event. And I highly encourage anybody who's listening right now or watching the recording to register. You can attend virtually, you can attend in person, and it's going to be just a really powerful couple of days where we can have the conversations that are way long overdue in this community. And today is just the tip of the iceberg. Today, we're just going to get started with everything. But I'm going to go ahead and be a little quiet and pass it along to our two amazing panelists to introduce themselves. Mac, would you like to go ahead and go first?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm super excited to be here. As you heard from Jason, I'm not only just a part of Equip, I'm also part of ANAD. So I'm Mac. I use she, her pronouns. I'm out here in Boise, Idaho. I volunteer at ANAD on the Community Engagement Board, and I'm also the LGBTQIA plus group lead for that group. It's been a super awesome opportunity. And of course, I'm accompanied by Carice. I am the employee engagement lead there, but also the Equip for All director. So luckily, I get to work on all things related to DEIB within our organization. Carice, I'll toss it over to you.
Great segue. Hi, everyone. My name is Carice, she, her pronouns. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and an LMFT supervisor. I came onto Equip as an eating disorder therapist and have been working in eating disorder communities pretty much since I was in grad school. It was kind of my first foray into the world of psychotherapy. Right now, as Mac described, I'm working on our people team, our HR team, overseeing like anything employee engagement, all of the inclusivity and belonging efforts at our company, both internally and externally as well as we're thinking about, who we're bringing in to partner with us. And I was really excited to join up on this topic and also really excited to just, have a space to talk and for myself to learn as well. When I joined the eating disorder community as a therapist, it was very homogenous and the patients all kind of came from a similar place. And we didn't, have distinct memories of looking back now on patients and thinking like, oh, this was probably going on and this was an intersection and I didn't have the language for it at the time. So also I'm here both as someone who's been in the field, but by no means an expert on what it's like to kind of live in intersectional identities with an eating disorder. So love to contribute and just chat with you all about this. Oh, and I have a pit bull who you might see pop
I
up
was going to
over
say,
here.
we're seeing like
Yeah,
glimpses of something, and
yeah,
I'm all about animals.
she's
So,
here. She's always asleep in her zone and she sleeps, we've tracked it 21 hours a day. So
wow.
yeah,
Okay.
no, she's a resting queen. We love
Yeah.
her. Her name is Glee. So yeah.
Well, this conversation is about to wake her up because it's going to be a good one.
Doubt it, but it doesn't mean it's not good.
But okay, so everyone, we'll go ahead and dive on into the topic of food insecurity. And I'll be honest, this is something that I have experienced in my own journey and impacted my own eating disorder recovery journey. But kind of similar to what you were saying, Carice, is I didn't have the language for it. I didn't really know it was a thing. I didn't understand it until years later. And now being part of this community and hearing other people's experiences and learning from them them. I can see the own bits and pieces of it in my own journey, but I'm also getting a better picture of what food insecurity is. And I was just looking at a statistic before we come on, and from Feeding America, they say that over 47 million Americans are living in a household that's food insecure right now. And that is too many. One is too many, but 47 million is a lot. So I'm wondering if either one of you could kind of enlighten us, tell us a little bit more about what we mean when we say food insecurity, and maybe some of the common barriers that individuals who are food insecure are facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing to start off with is there's ranges of experiences that can come with food insecurity. Doesn't directly access to hunger, right? I mean, that can be underneath what food insecurity is, but it's also this thing that happens where you don't have consistent access to food that creates your life worth living, right? And so, I mean, as someone who's experienced it for 10 plus years and kind of started my life off in that capacity, I've seen it in many different ways. So, one way was when we were houseless, my grandma who raised me, she didn't expect to be a parent at the age of 40. And when she was a parent at the age of 40, she really just didn't have the resources to take care of me in the way that was needed. So being part of that statistic was interesting in the sense that we experienced multiple facets of food insecurity. So the first one was living in a shelter and having access to food, but food that didn't align with my culture or what I was used to eating. That was really, really tough because the food that I was eating was not really accessible, and it was also becoming a fear food in and of itself. Then we kind of translated to being able to, as we were houseless, having access to food that was expired, to say the least. And one thing I experienced continually within my journey to recovery was I used to get food poisoning quite often. So there was access to food, right? And not per se hunger, but there was this piece happening where I was actually getting more sick than I was getting the nutrition I needed. Then the next faucet could go underneath of food insecurity is not having access to food at all and having true hunger, right? Which is something we experienced on that road as well, and had to make different changes within our life to meet those needs. So again, food insecurity isn't just a monolith. You'll see many experiences of it, and the barriers that come with it are stigma, shame, invalidation, and also it's really tough when you're thinking about it from someone in a single care or untraditional household. To admit that you have food insecurity puts you at a higher risk of being investigated by different federal identities, right? If it's CPS or anything like that, because maybe the home isn't providing what the kiddo needs. And so, in my own journey, I've just seen so many different variations of it and talking to friends who've experienced food insecurity.
Mhm. I'm always appreciative of you, Mac, when you share, kind of the like, I went through this and this is how it felt. And, I am somebody who has not had lived experience either with an eating disorder or food insecurity. So have more been, sitting in the provider chair and hearing the stories of folks. And I am a big systems thinker, as Mac knows. And something I always think about is like, we tend to simplify, I think, just by the narrative of it by like, movies about it, that it just means you don't have money to buy food or you don't, And what I've seen sitting in my office over the years is, food insecurity can come from things such as the person has agoraphobia. I had a patient one time who had agoraphobia and was afraid to leave the house and didn't have a community of people that could like support her and bring her food and, was oftentimes like the biggest issue in her kind of ability to access mental health and like brain regulation was nutrition. And there was a barrier there to where she, like her mental health was keeping her from getting that. Or I think about, in our current world, there are food banks that are tied to, like my partner works in a public school. There's a food bank there, but you have to go to that school. And in this current climate, a lot of folks at the school are afraid to bring their kids to school or kind of leave their home. And so even getting to the places where they're getting providence of food is really, really complicated and trauma based. And so I think about, yes, there's those obvious things that we know can cause food insecurity. And then on an individual level, there are barriers that are often hidden or not considered that we also haven't quite figured out a perfect solution for either, as we're just getting the lay of the landscape. So it's such a big question, kind of like, what is it? What is this about? I think you could ask each person, and it's a little different for them. And we certainly have these systemic issues like people who are in areas that are specifically not resourced with enough food options for people, things like that. But yeah, I've thought about lots of years of stories of people saying like it isn't as easy as just go get the food and eat it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. You kind of answered one of the questions that I used to get is, well, why didn't you just ask for help? Or why didn't you speak out? And especially, Mac, when you said the stigma and the shame around that. And then there's the systemic barriers that other people face. And like in my instance, I was working full time, but I could still not afford food. And it was one of those things where, so then I didn't qualify for assistance because I had a full-time job and all of that. And it's one of those things that kind of just escalates and it snowballs. And people aren't, sitting there deciding not to seek help or assistance. It's almost impossible sometimes to get that help and assistance. One of the terms that, or two of the terms that kind of get thrown around a lot when we talk about food insecurity is food deserts and food swamps. And I was wondering if one of you could kind of maybe define those a little bit more so that people who are listening had a better understanding of what we mean when we say food desert or food swamp.
Mac, you want to take the start of this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting living in areas and living in a state where we actually have a high amount of food deserts. So in that, I used to live in a very rural area here in Idaho, and there's many rural areas. I mean, I would argue all across the Midwest. Not me calling Idaho the Midwest. Now people are going to be like, "No,
I'm
Mac,
like, we're the
you're,
Midwest in
you
Minneapolis.
know your geography, Mac." I'm gonna be like, everyone thinks that Idaho's the Midwest. But anyways, that being said, a lot of Midwest states, and also I would throw Idaho in there as well, of what I've seen is that you'll only have one access to one grocery store in a city that serves about 2,000 to 5,000 folks, right? And so materials are already limited when it comes to diverse food, but then also the type of food you're eating as it relates to the nutritional content, right? So I think a prime example that comes up to me is, we were trying to access something to make a very popular Ethiopian dish that my grandma didn't have access to because it was all sold out, right? So in that, food deserts are basically not having access to resources, but you also don't have the grocery stores and limited opportunity to buy from those areas. And again, I've seen that here, but it can look many different ways, especially actually in the Midwest where Carice is from.
Hmm. Yeah, I would also tack onto that, sometimes it can feel, I think we confuse the word desert with like unpopulated, like, in the middle of nowhere. In Minneapolis, where I live, literally within half a mile, we've got one area town that has very, very limited options. Certainly no options for anyone with restrictions or medical needs for specific foods or cultural reasons to eat a certain way. And then less than half a mile down the road, we've got every chain of grocery store plus a mom and pop shop that like we've got everything there. And so what we think about here in Minneapolis doing advocacy work is like, even just like I could say as a person of privilege, okay, we'll just drive to that part of town. And like just driving is a privilege, right? And so like not everybody has access to transportation. And so even just being able to get, so someone might look at a map with kind of a low systems thinking and be like, this isn't a desert, there's all these things. And then we have to really get into the microscope of it all and be like, yeah, but how can person A who lives over here, who is perhaps disabled and cannot drive themselves, gonna get here and back and carry the bags and do all of that? And so, truly liberation is removing barriers not only of cost, but of access, of ease, of walkability, of, ability to have them delivered to your house. That was something that was really interesting. I felt during the pandemic was, suddenly everyone understood the value of grocery delivery, right? And we were like, this is the thing. I mean, my wife and I were like sanitizing all of the things, you know what I mean? Like it was that time. And as things started to go back to where we are now, it started to feel like we were kind of devaluing that. Like, oh, now we should just go out and like just assume everybody can go out and get the food. Rather than taking that opportunity to be like, how do we actually make this a permanent change to where any type of food that you need can easily arrive? at your door. You know, delivery services started adding their fees back in, things like that. And we really lost that accessibility. And what was once a food swamp or, you know, a rich, lush food area was a desert again in a matter of months to a year.
It's interesting you say that too, because I always go back to the conversation of social determinants of health, right? And what are we considering when it means to access health? I think health accessibility isn't just, again, going back to monoliths, it's just not one singular aspect that you need to consider. I did find it fascinating when we did come out of COVID. This is a conversation we've actually heard prevalent in the LGBTQIA groups here at ANAD is, you know, the delivery fees.
Hmm.
They tripled but also like quadrupled in the last even year.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, and then that's on top of rising grocery costs as it is.
Right,
So it's just,
right.
yeah, the issue is compounded there. So now I guess linking it all back, how does food insecurity link to an eating disorder? And what's that relationship like there and that connection there?
Absolutely. Chris, I'd love to hear more of your clinical
Hmm.
insight that you've seen since now that I know since grad school. I'm learning all these
Yes,
things about you now.
yes.
Um,
2008
and
was the
I can
first
speak
time.
a little bit to what I've seen not only in my own personal community, but also my own lived experience.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of paint a picture of like if I am working with the patient and we are trying to heal their relationship with food, um, in a perfect world, right, we could wave our magic wand. And if I say, hey, we're going to do an exposure to this particular type of food, if this is something that has been on a never list for you for a while, and that that food is either something that could come to their door or, you know, they have access to be able to get it. And so, like, the barrier itself is the eating disorder and the way that it like creates narratives and bodily responses to food. That's hard enough as it is. If we are then being like, okay, they can't actually go buy this, or it doesn't exist in where they are, or what that's going to do to this eating disorder that, by the way, is looking for every possible reason not to relent, right? What it's going to do is it's going to like give it ammunition to be like, well, then let's not do it, right? And so if I'm here and we're ready and we've talked it up and we're ready to like do an exposure, face that fear, and that person has an additional barrier that exists outside of the room of the provider and the patient and the eating disorder, that makes it even harder and it creates even longer of a ramp to recovery because we're having to like kind of navigate these social systems that are kind of placed upon our patients just to do our work, right? Like it'd be like a surgeon that didn't have any of the tools in the room and we couldn't like actually perform the surgery or like help that person heal. Like it is truly working without the actual nourishing medicine that it takes to recover from an eating disorder. And I love how we've talked about, we've shifted away. When I started in the field, I think we were still kind of doing the like healthy food, not healthy food thing. We were just trying to work with it, you know, instead of being like, let's totally just correct this whole thing altogether. So what I love is that now patients can say, here's what I have access to, even if it's not kind of that robust buffet of options. And we're scrappy and we'll make it work and we'll say all food is good food and we're going to figure it out. I love that that has been a cultural shift. And at the end of the day, like facing food insecurity is absolutely like working with at least one and a half hands behind your back and trying to heal this very, very, very difficult disease without the medicine and the tools that you need to do that. To put it lightly, it's very, very difficult.
I like the you always have a good metaphor for like
Thanks.
that tie into the work itself. I don't know. I just love it. When I think about the link, kind of like just piggybacking on that in the sense of my own lived experience and what I've seen in our own recovery circles for food insecurity, because we've had this discussion not only here in Idaho, but through ANAD and everywhere else, the Emily Connection, just to give another pinpoint. But the biggest thing I also catch is, you know, two to Latinx and Black and African American populations are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience food insecurity than their white counterparts, right? And these are the same populations that are also not getting diagnosed with an eating disorder. So when we're not even considering their own experiences to getting an eating disorder and then to get diagnosed because they're so exhausted for advocating for themselves, the linkage is is already there. It's invalidation. It's having lack of access. And then when you do have access to the food, right? I think about this for myself is after 10 plus years of being houseless and being food insecure, when I did have access to consistent food, my binge behaviors came out in a whole new manifestation that I didn't even know that could happen. So that linkage then leads to a higher likelihood, especially if we're looking at Black and African American populations, to driving to binge purging. And so in that altogether, I think there's just a bigger systemic conversation that you hinted to, Carice, of the populations that are being inherently impacted by food insecurity.
Mhm.
And that kind of touches on what my next question was going to be, is around that connection with food insecurity and binge eating disorder. That is a conversation that comes up quite frequently in the groups that I lead too. And I hear a lot of times that individuals who are now in a position where they can afford groceries or they can pick up food, there is so much anxiety and stress and fear that happens when they go to the grocery store and then when they bring this food home, that oftentimes they're either one restricting or two they're binging, or somewhere they're getting on that restriction and binge cycle again, that that can happen years after the food insecurity has kind of left the picture. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, only from, from my own lived experience, my grandma, she's the one who her job during the day was to go clean hotel rooms. And so in that, she would get free food from the hotel itself. At that point, we were also getting support going through public assistance to have food stamps, right? And so when I had my first interactions of full-blown grocery shopping, like having a grocery cart that was fully filled and had the things that I was looking to eat, right? um, my concern was it was going to go away. Right. My concern was this was going to be the last minute. I was going to have a full cabinet. This was going to be the only minute, and I would just consume it all out of fear and out of concern. And so with that relationship of scarcity and like not knowing what your future is and the unknown ties into how you present with your food insecurity. And that will lead into your recovery years and years down the line. I mean, I remember when I was in college and I was still like, I don't know if this is going to be the time that I grocery shop. Is this going to be the one time I do it this month because I can't afford to go again? And so that fear lingers in the back of your head. But it's not only fear, it's the trauma and also the parts of the system that felt like it failed you at times.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm thinking too as you're talking, Mac. Mac knows this about me, but I spent a good chunk of my career working in like comprehensive sex education, sex and relationships counseling. And what I can say is abstinence solves nothing in terms of controlling behavior. And so we often talk about, in our work, we say the binge restrict cycle, like binges are caused by this presence of a restrictive nature, right? And our bodies, and I think in their wisdom, even if we label this as a disorder or pathology, our bodies in their wisdom are always wanting to balance out. And so when Mac talks about, of course, when that food is present and there's that fear and she hasn't had it before and like suddenly she does and it's like, oh, what if it changes? Like our bodies in their wisdom want to prep for that, right? And so it might even more kind of front load those behaviors and those compulsions to do that. And we can understand even outside of food restriction, like the binge restrict cycle, when we're restricting, we're saying we're like keeping things, our bodies are like, oh, we need to like go into a state of starvation to survive. And then when we're binging, it's like, oh, finally, I have these nutrients that I need, and it kind of overcompensates for it. And then that feels terrible. And so the restriction starts again. And so, like, when we look at the systems at play here, you know, I think I've heard a lot of labeling of, especially people with BED and especially people from marginalized identities that have BED as sort of like, this is more of like a selfish presentation of the disease. Like if you lived without food for so long, why are you binging? Like it doesn't, it's just kind of a judgmental take on it. And if we look at Mac's story and if we look at other things like, other compulsive things that fall kind of in that category, things like hoarding, things that are like, we would look at that and be like, a judgmental perspective would be like, why are we doing that? And if we actually get curious and we say, but no, why are they doing that? And what is happening there? And what is the fear? And what are they trying to kind of balance out that they've experienced in their life? And so when this is the other part is I love to tell people it's harder to do this now in this day and age as a therapist. I used to love to tell people, let's challenge those fears because the likelihood of, this traumatic thing happening again as it was, let's say it was a terrible car accident, the likelihood that you will get this in this exact car accident again is very low. And so we process through the trauma and we kind of heal that trauma. Now, if I'm looking at somebody who's facing systemic food insecurity, I can't say to them, "Hey, you have access to food now, and look, we're out of the fire, right? We're safe, we're landed." I can't actually say that in my heart of hearts, knowing that this is happening. It's not just a one-time thing, it's a systemic thing, right? So I don't want to tell people like, "You've made it out to safety," because that might not be true, right? We have to meet people where they're at in the reality that they live. And so when we work with this type of kind of vacillating access to food, we are still trying to like help them feel in control, and like a place to truly heal BED means that you have all the options and we just get to work on dealing with some of those trauma-based narratives that lead to that compulsive behavior or lead to that type of thing. But we have the food and we don't have to question that, right? But that's so unlikely for many, many people that Mac is talking about.
It's so fascinating you say this because I think about my college experience when I had a roommate that I got really close to, and she was presenting in similar ways, and I was like, just out of curiosity, like what was your childhood like? Like I was just really curious to know what she went through, and it turned out that she was houseless actually for more than 10 years, longer than I had been. And so for her, she wouldn't even put the food out in our shared living space. She would actually keep it in her room because she
Mhm.
felt that she didn't want to share. There was a risk, right? And as much as I could validate her and show up as a friend, she just didn't want to share the food and she wasn't going to be open to that. And it brought up a lot of things for myself of like, wow, like she never got told that she deserved to heal from this. Just like I was still battling the same thing in college. So it's just a fascinating phenomenon you catch throughout your whole entire life with folks that you don't even know yet.
It is fascinating. It also makes me feel sad on like, as we sit here today, there are enough resources in the world to like house, feed, clothe everybody. And yet we've created these systems where like certain people have to kind of like have a more fearful scarcity, trauma-based response, and certain people aren't even thinking about it. It's just, they don't have to even consider this for a minute in their life, or they have excess, right? Or they don't. It's just, yeah. If we go down that pathway, there's a lot of, frustration and anger, and rightfully so. But it is, as human behavior scientists, I look at this and say, this was never how we were supposed to interact with the resources that we have.
Oh, I need that. I need that tattooed on my body. I like that quote of just like the interactions we have. It reminds me of I was working with a food bank that asked me, I was doing some volunteerism, and they were asking me, well, what do you do at the community center? Which has actually spoken to Jason here for LGBTQIA month and Pride Month. We brought them along, but they're a nonprofit here in Idaho, and we have a food pantry that we give free food to, and folks just walk in, they write down how many items they take, and they walk straight out, right? We don't ask for
Hmm.
their name, their address, nothing. And I was telling the food bank and I was telling a lot of folks that I was volunteering and partnering with, if you just make it as simple as that, folks will come in and access the resource because if they can walk in and out and not have that moment of interaction, sometimes that's what even amplifies the stigma. So,
Hmm.
um, it's just a
Or I
great
think
call.
about like the most recently, like the fires in California. I was really touched. I'm always really touched by moments where humans kind of default to the community care model that I think is just in our bones, and like that's how we survive best. And what was interesting about that is certainly like any natural disaster, like communities of marginalized identity and lower income were impacted much, much more than those who, might have lost their house, which is very traumatic, and also had the resources to like rebuild. But there was a time where it was like everybody lost everything. And people from neighboring communities brought in what they had and truly just had like a resource share, no barriers. Let's not even bring money into this conversation. We're just going to put everything we have in this space, and there's no stigma to walk up and get it because look around you, we just lost. Like that, that's what gives me hope sometimes is that as hard as it is and as sad as it is that it takes a natural disaster to really bring out, I think, that community love and care that we have in our DNA. When I see that, I'm like, yeah, see, this is actually what we want this kind of relationship, barrier-free relationship to the resources we need. But man, is it hard to get there and seemingly impossible to get there.
Yeah, it is so sad that we have to go through those catastrophes and those disasters in order to really see the best of humankind sometimes.
Hmm.
Because it happens time and time again. Whenever you turn on the news and there's been a disaster, then you see the community come together and it's nice for a couple of weeks and then it disappears again. And it's just so frustrating that we can't get it to stick. Along those lines, and Chris, this is something that you kind of touched on earlier, but there's a relationship there when it comes to food insecurity and trauma response. And I think that so often we think of trauma as being those events, like you mentioned, where it's an accident, or maybe they went through a natural disaster, or the death of a loved one, or something like that. But food insecurity in and of itself can actually elicit a trauma response, right?
Absolutely. And as somebody who's sat across folks with many different types of traumas, we might call a car accident or a death of somebody an acute trauma, which it just means it's like contained in an experience. It kind of happened in a short time, but the length of that is still really impactful, right? I will tell you that it is by far harder to heal trauma that is that death by a thousand paper cuts, that ongoing, because what our bodies want to do, and this happens in the natural world, like when an animal is being chased by a predator, it runs away. If it makes it, it runs away. It gets to a hill of safety. Oftentimes there's an adrenaline response and the body shakes, and you might see like deer or something doing that after they've outrun something. And human bodies mimic that in the sense that like oftentimes, and I'll put this in relationship context, when let's say you've been in a very abusive relationship and you leave that relationship or something happens, you're able to move out, and then you get with somebody who is safe, oftentimes we'll see the manifestation of the trauma in that safe place because it's safe enough to actually heal. You are not consistently in fight, flight, freeze. You are not consistently in that limbic state where you're just white knuckling trying to survive. You can actually drop down and be like, okay, what the heck happened to me? And let's actually, and so we'll see some escalated behaviors in that couple, even though that's a very safe person. And we have to really say, like, look, you were in survival mode up until this point, and it's really hard to trust and to shift out of it, that now it's okay to heal and let your guard down. And so when somebody is facing these systemic, again, like constant state of trauma, is perhaps the worst thing on our nervous system. It's almost better to have like and then you have a clean way to sort of heal from that on a clean timeline. But this consistent set of re-injuring, 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 it is absolutely possible. I don't want anyone to lose hope. Like it is still very possible and your body wants to heal. It just becomes kind of we are moving forward while also kind of toggling in, okay, what's the most recent trauma as we're dealing with this one? And it takes a very, I think, patient and dynamic like tango with your provider to ensure that you're treating what has happened in the past simultaneously with what is happening in the current moment and what could happen at the future in the future all at one time. And so people never get used to, they will survive and our bodies will adapt to it, but our nervous systems don't get used to a sustained state of trauma. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to get you through it, but it's not designed to process it until you're in a place of safety, which is very hard to get to for many people.
Yeah, and I was one of those people. I was in that kind of, survival mode for 15 plus years in my life, and it was just those tiny paper cuts, just nonstop. And that's why I clung to my eating disorder, or that was one of the reasons why, because it seemed like the only thing I could control. It seemed like the only safety or the only sense of worth that I still had, because everything else just seemed so painful. And because of everything else that was happening, I didn't realize the pain that was associated with the eating disorder. So it kind of just left everything going unchecked. The trauma was there, the grief was there, the eating disorder was there. And unfortunately, I think oftentimes when you're in a situation like that, you don't realize just how
Mhm.
bad it is. This topic actually came up last night in our support group here at ANID, but I was talking about how when the storm is actually going on, we don't see the damage that's happening. It's after the fact that we go
Mhm.
through and we see the damage. And I think that's so often the case when you're dealing with an eating disorder or trauma response or food insecurity is at that time, you don't even realize the impact that it's taking on your mental health and your mental well-being until you're actually removed from it and you've got a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, who's got time to do that? Like you're trying to, right? Like who's got the time, the luxury of time to think about how am I doing when you're really just trying to stay alive and you're trying to just make it through and distraction often gets, labeled as maybe a lesser coping strategy. And it's like it's the best, like I am never judgmental on how people got through things and what they had to do. And if, your distractions or your coping strategies, no matter how much they do need to be dealt with because they are in itself, the most dangerous thing. Whenever I meet with patients, I have always said, like, I will never judge why and how, the eating disorder showed up because you were suffering, right? And because your brain disease made that even more an option for you in those moments that was easy to reach for. It's also a thing that could kill you, so we definitely want to deal with that, but we're not going to take any judgment for what it has been like, what you needed to do to get by.
Yeah, that's, that's an important soundbite right there. I will be pulling that for later use too, because that is so important. And I think that touches upon so many different things that we see within the eating disorder community when it comes to just that provider-patient relationship, or a loved one even who's supporting someone who's experiencing an eating disorder. We so often want to point fingers and judge and
Hmm.
accuse, and that's the absolute worst thing that
Yeah,
that you could do. Like I'm good enough at judging myself and putting myself down. I don't need a provider to tell me something or a loved one
yeah,
to tell me that. I know it might come from a place of help, but that's the absolute worst thing that could happen. But
yeah.
that's a separate conversation and one that we could
Next
totally
session. We'll
have.
talk about that next
Yeah,
session.
one
No
that we could
judgments.
totally have later. One thing
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, Mac, is you mentioned it with the community center there in Boise, but there is also a lot of food insecurity that happens within the LGBTQIA plus community. I saw a statistic the other day where it's 1 in 4 LGBTQIA plus youth are kicked out of their homes and abandoned by their family when they come out. And that can lead to periods of being unhoused and to food insecurity. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the impact that you see in that community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why we offer a food pantry, but then we offer a place for folks to stay in our community. It's called the community center, right? Like it's an open door policy for folks to come on in during our operating hours. And what I've caught there is even just sitting there and like hosting those open hours is folks just come in and they're just silently sitting in a chair, right? Just because they just want a spot to know that they're being taken care of and looked after and sitting with a bunch of people who are just reading books, watching movies. We have couches, right? It's really fascinating because when we started our youth program, which we started years ago, Youth Alliance Diversity YAD program, um, it was fascinating to see allies of carers be like, oh, we definitely need this program because my kiddo just came out and I really need support. But then also to see folks kind of push back and say, well, they don't know themselves at that point, right? How do you know that they're actually LGBTQIA? Like, you shouldn't be offering this resource because now you're persuading folks. And our whole stance is, regardless of what they're identifying as and what they present as, they can come on in and get the resources they need. When I think about the impact, though, I really think that, you know, that's just a marginalization in and of itself of being able to present your identity. I mean, for myself, I didn't get to come out until I was in recovery because, as Chris was saying, and as you were saying, you don't see the damage after the storm. I didn't want to add any more intersectionality to myself. It was already dangerous to be food insecure, low income, in a bigger body, and I looked nothing like the rest of my family. So to come out as gay on top of that was like a hard no for me. And once I did get to recovery and have that form of self-actualization and say, you know what, this is how I present and this is my identity, I felt I could be in that spot. Not saying that my grandma would have kicked me out, right? But I wasn't going to run the risk. I wasn't going to run any type of risk of marginalization. And we tend to see that in the community center as well, as those who are presenting as straight are actually just hiding from their full blown
Mhm.
out.
I mean, that's also why, really having no judgment in general is best practice for anything. But like, there have been times where, we're treating queer youth and they tell the care team, like, I can't have my parents know my pronoun, right? Like, I can't come out, and like, it's getting more complicated in kind of the like legal landscape of all of that in all 50 states that we work. And, one thing that we always talk about is like, there is no default, you must come out. And also, we want to say, if you're out, you deserve care, you deserve resources, you deserve all those things. But like to Mac's point, when we see people purposefully containing parts of their identity, I think it can make us feel sad because we want that life in which all of us can come out and just live our gayest lives and, whatever. And like the reality is that that is not safe for a lot of people. And so either when someone does have that courage to come out, especially our youth, our queer youth, they have the courage to come out, or if they've been outed, that time for so many reasons from a brain science perspective is so important that it is a human right that they deserve to have food, housing, attachment to a caregiver, all of those things that really support healthy brain development. And they are definitely more at risk. And so us as providers really have to take each case and meet them where they are and say, I've had youth I've worked with years ago in private practice where they've said, I don't want to come out. I can't come out. Help me figure out how not to come out. And the rainbow advocate in me is like, no, I want a world in which you can do that. And if I were to have pushed my agenda to say, no, I want you to do this, I'd be losing what their individual world and experience was. And so, yeah, they certainly, I mean, babies, children that are turned away from their nurturance for whatever reason will will absolutely make brain disorders like eating disorders and other mental health conditions and physical health conditions just compound on an already vulnerable population.
Yeah, so we've talked about no judgment and meeting people where they're at. What are some other tips or tools that peer supporters, loved ones, other providers out there could take when they're trying to support an individual who is experiencing food insecurity or perhaps has experienced it at some point in their journey?
Oh, I'm like going back to one of the one of the agents that actually helped my grandma and I destigmatized a lot of the agencies that we were scared of being from marginalized communities. I was um I was surprised to see, like, for example, a lot of the food banks we were nervous to go to because we were scared we were going to get, my grandma was really concerned she was going to get me taken away from her. That was the biggest thing. And once we got to sit down and actually talk to CPS and learn about our resources, our options, we actually got more access to public assistance. And the person, I'm still in contact with her today. She changed my whole view of personal support and she helped me through college when I couldn't afford groceries. And so I think it's just opening the lens for those individuals who are in those settings of care support. And I'm not just talking about individual carers and partners. I'm talking about the people who are offering, creating content that destigmatizes. Jason, I look at you for ANAD, right? A lot of folks who join our first support groups are like, do I have to pay? Like, what do I have to do here? What are you expecting from me? There's no way this support group is free for eating disorder care. And I'm like, I just show up and you can be camera off. How cool is that, right? And so we've really like destigmatize what it looks like to get free accessible support here at ANAD. And so we need to do that through these agencies, through public assistance, through all these programs that are offered, and to know that they're really here for support and it's not coming out of a place of taking something away from you. And I can confidently say that for my grandma as well.
I think I want to speak to the people listening or watching the recording. Like, if you are somebody who has not had to think about this, the approach that Mac and I take is from a calling in perspective. Like, I never want to be like, well, you're terrible because you have no idea what this is like. I do want to invite them in and say, we do at a certain point have to like step out of our privilege and go look at systems and be specific to like turn away from our current reality and look into what's going on. Understanding such nuanced things like you were speaking to, Jason, where it's like there's this impossible kind of narrow bracket of income that if you don't make enough, you can get these resources. But if you make a penny or two, or pennies don't exist anymore, I guess, a dime or two over that, like it's taken away from you, or you are in a worse position than and that's, what the lie of that tells us is like, just get a job, just make more money. But like the way that that immediately catapults you back into a state of poverty or whatever it is, like that people who are in positions of privilege at large aren't aware of the like tap dance you have to do in that in between space. And so I'm speaking to others, myself included, that like we have to choose to turn and look at that, and it's not comfortable and it doesn't feel good. And like that really, there's no way that we can be doing, especially providers, there's no way that we can be doing the work for a large kind of population of folks with many different backgrounds. If I'm not going to understand it on a cellular level, I'm definitely going to go and investigate it more and try to understand it from a research and dig into and understand their experience level. Um, and so the best thing I think that people in privilege can do is like all government is small government, look around in your community, like who is doing this work to, break down these barriers. If you yourself are somebody that can throw money towards an organization, great. If you're not that person, but you still want to be a part of it, like listen to the stories, believe people when they tell you there's these barriers, and start to get creative about like brick by brick, how do we kind of turn this ship around to a place where those community care options are not tiny dots on the map and only happen if there's a catastrophe, but where we need the entire community. We don't just need the activists and we don't just need the people who are in privilege. We need everybody to like have a role in that. And so start small, start with your block, your community, right? You don't have to ask if somebody is food insecure to host an event where you're feeding your community, right? You can just do that and you can just offer that and make that a rotational thing in your community, whatever that is. I think there are lots of communities who are just really good at that in general. So learn from them, take from them, and really just know that you have power, even if it feels small and you're not going to fix the system tomorrow. You can start really small with that.
That calling in book takes me to the place of what Loretta says of like there's humanity in words, right? Which is the destigmatizing, having the conversation. There's also humanity in action though, right?
Mhm.
In the way we show up day to day. So if you see someone, you see your roommate, right? Hiding food, start with curiosity there, right? Offer that space for them to know that you're there for support regardless.
I want to brag because there's this place in Minneapolis. If you are from Minneapolis, you'll know. There's this coffee shop called the Get Down Coffee Shop. It's a Black-owned coffee shop in North Minneapolis, which is a part of town often associated with food deserts, things like that. And my wife and I go there almost every Sunday. They have the best lattes in the city, et cetera, et cetera. But they have recently been paying for a food truck to just come and give. Last time it was catfish. There's like always different things. And like part of their business model is just like you can come and get your coffee and you don't even have to buy food here. But like right next to the shop, there's this food truck and you don't have to pay them. You can just walk up, you can just get it. And this coffee shop by no means is some big corporation that has this type of funding to do that. And like the community impact and the fact that like it's kind of packaged in this way where, yeah, you can walk up to a food truck and that's something that's a really normalized behavior. Like I'm just so impressed with like small businesses that say we might not have tons of revenue in backstock. And like from the front, our value is if you're coming here for community, we're going to expand on what that community means and really take care of you as a community member. So if you do live here or if you want to come here, please go support them and people like that doing that work.
Compassionate in the action. That is the example that you just provided. And that just segued me really well to the Houston Food Bank, where the BIPOC Eating Disorder Conference will be hosted at. It's one circular room if you've never been at the Houston Food Bank, and if you are coming live to Houston, Texas, so you get to sit in a room of community as you're learning from some of the folks and experts in the field. So in that, if you have the space and capacity, there's not only one way to give support to Houston Food Bank. It doesn't only have to be monetarily, but we will be highlighting their website after this call. Looking to you, Jason.
Yeah, well, you have all the resources, so you always just send them my way, and I would be glad to share them. Yeah, because the Houston Food Bank is doing amazing work. I used to live in Houston, so it's a little bit of a hometown shout out there. But along those lines, Mac, what are some additional resources that individuals could maybe seek out in their own communities or states? Are there any national programs or just really what's out there if somebody is experiencing food insecurity and possibly, with an eating disorder on top of it?
Absolutely. I think the biggest one I want to highlight is Feeding America. They do a really great job of providing free resource networks. So if you reach out to them and you're like, I don't know what's in my local area, they will provide that to you, because there's so many different needs in different communities that are being offered, regardless if it's a food bank, if it's a community-based network. The next thing I want to highlight, which is not very publicized in a lot of different communities, but in African communities, in Black and African American communities, we actually do this thing of platters and plates. So folks who are making extra food, right? Say they make, like, we like to make a whole goat, right? Well, the whole goat can't feed our whole family, right? So we'll divide it up on platters and give it out to the community. Those are usually offered within areas that you see diverse populations. I'm thinking about Phoenix, Arizona, and things like that. Feeding American can provide you that information as well. And then for those, I know we talked about the LGBTQIA plus community. Those folks, please reach out to the Trevor Project. They're doing amazing work right now. They have a whole text line of support that you can reach out to consistently to talk about these things. And also they will follow up with you via email on resources that can provide day to day. And last but certainly not least, when you are in the space of capacity as someone who didn't know how to ask for help, talk to the folks around you. I really, really encourage it. I think my grandma and I had to look at each other at one point when we were getting public assistance. My grandma's like, it's okay to talk about this now. And once she kind of gave me the permission to start talking about it with folks, that's when I realized, okay, I can ask for help. And I started doing that within going to school and getting free lunches. One thing I will give you all, and this is a tip I give to everyone as it relates to food insecurity topics, is if you can do this, you can actually call your local schools around you and pay balances for kids who have balances missing on lunch programs. It varies state by state, but basically for some states, if the balance isn't paid within that school year, the following year they will not offer free school lunch, right? And so it's really disheartening. It hurts, right? And they really need that support. You can do it anonymously, and it can be really, really easy. This was one of the first gifts I got when I got to middle school was, they called my grandma and they said, your whole account's wiped. My grandma was like, what do you mean my whole account's wiped? Like I owed $400. And they're like, no, you don't owe it. You're good for the next 4 to 5 years. And so
Mhm.
in that, if you can make those phone calls and contribute as much as you can, I do encourage it.
I want to just take a beat because that gave me chills and I really love that. And, what a gift to give somebody to just remove one thing out of the many things. As a therapist who used to be in private practice, my advice to individual, if you're a provider on the call or if you are somebody who works in the private practice and you're kind of isolated, befriend your local social workers if that is not your background. There have been so many times because in the psychotherapy track, when you take a licensure towards, clinical counseling, there's some social work stuff in there, but then the social workers take this track where they're much more connected to the community and like don't feel bad as if like you should have known what the food banks were when we have a patient with food insecurity. Like, don't sit in that feeling of not being enough as a provider. Like, get in your network, learn more, tell them, hey, I am here on your side. I don't have this particular answer, but I have a buddy who does, and I'm going to ask her and I'm going to get back to you. And so befriend your local social worker. Make sure in your network you have people who can say, hey, at this grocery store, they're doing a food bank, or at this elementary, they're doing a food bank. Like, tap your village to know where the spots are. Don't feel like you have to perfectly know all of it. You just have to be able yourself to ask for help to find the help that those people need.
Well, amazing resources, an amazing conversation. I want to thank you both for sharing your experiences and your perspectives on this. And yeah, I think this is the start of a deeper conversation too. We need to keep this going year round until, again, that 47 million number is zero. Um,
Hmm.
so thank you both for the amazing work that you're doing within your communities. And thank you for joining us for the conversation today. Everybody who's listening to this, if you registered for the event, I will share a lot of those links that have been shared as resources throughout in the email that I'm about to send out. If you're watching this recorded on YouTube, send me an email. I will be happy to connect you with additional resources. So again, Carice, Mac, thank you so much. Mac, give us one more shout out to the BIPOC Eating Disorder Conference before we go. Where can folks register for that?
You can register at BIPOCeatingdisorderconference.com. It's that simple. It's BIPOC as in BIPOC. Yes, I can do that. And you would just follow through on all of that. And it's not eating disorder, it's ED conference. In that you can register. There's many different discounts. Those for you that are students, those of you that are BIPOC and non-BIPOC. So you'll see a bunch of different registration codes as it relates to access. And of course, always you can email them at BIPOC at Gmail. They will follow up with you directly.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, we're looking forward to the conference and thank you again for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks everyone.
Take care.